Tonight we begin with a decision that Western intelligence officials had anticipated, that Kremlin watchers had warned about, and that military strategists had been gaming out for months. A decision that unfolded not over weeks of careful deliberation, but in a single explosive 24-hour window. 24 hours that shattered Vladimir Putin's so-called red line. 24 hours that rewrote the rules of Western military support for Ukraine. 24 hours that demonstrated what happens when democracies decide they've had enough of being bullied. What the United States and United Kingdom did this week crossed a line that Putin had drawn in blood and fire, a line he swore would trigger catastrophic consequences if violated. And when that line was crossed, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with devastating precision, with operational brilliance, and with a strike package that lit up Russian military positions across multiple fronts. This is the story of how two of the world's oldest democracies looked at a dictator's ultimatum and said, no. And how Ukraine, armed with that permission, delivered a blow that the Kremlin will not soon forget. For nearly 2 years now, there had been whispers, not official policy announcements, not formal diplomatic communiques, just whispers, that the Biden administration was preparing something fundamentally different in its approach to arming Ukraine. Washington has been cautious, yes, but they have been increasingly frustrated in their caution. Their decisions have followed a certain pattern, a predictability, almost a timidity that Putin had learned to exploit. First they said no tanks, then they sent tanks. First they said no long-range missiles, then they sent ATACMS. First they said no F-16s, then they approved F-16s. Each escalation came slowly, reluctantly, always one step behind what the battlefield demanded. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this week was that the pattern suddenly accelerated. Intelligence analysts who monitor American and British decision-making know the indicators. The unusual frequency of secure calls between the White House and Downing Street. The sudden cancellation of a planned Pentagon press briefing. The deployment of additional intelligence assets to monitor Russian nuclear forces. The quiet repositioning of American military assets in Europe. All of that activity spiked. And whenever Washington and London coordinate that intensively, it means a major decision is imminent. Putin saw this too. And that's when he issued his most explicit threat yet. Early Monday morning, Russian state media broadcast what the Kremlin described as a final warning to NATO capitals, including specific language about the use of Western long-range weapons against targets inside Russia. Putin himself appeared on camera, something he rarely does for routine announcements, declaring that any authorization of strikes on Russian soil using American or British missiles would be treated as direct NATO participation in the conflict. These are the kinds of threats that Putin only makes when he is signaling something very specific. An intent to escalate, a willingness to use unconventional responses, or a desperation to prevent a specific Western action. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his rhetorical posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts from implicit warnings to explicit threats, even incrementally, every intelligence agency in the Western world pays attention. The question facing President Biden and Prime Minister Keir Starmer was stark. Do we allow Putin's threats to dictate what weapons Ukraine can use to defend itself? Do we accept that a dictator's red lines override a sovereign nation's right to strike back at its invader? Or do we finally call the bluffs? By Tuesday evening we had our answer. The White House confirmed, through a carefully worded statement, that the United States had authorized Ukraine to use ATACMS missiles against military targets inside Russian territory. Hours later, Downing Street issued a parallel confirmation regarding Storm Shadow cruise missiles. The red line wasn't just crossed. It was obliterated. The threat issued by Putin tonight in response was not normal. It was not routine. It was not the kind of performative bluster we've grown accustomed to over 3 years of war. It was venomous. Kremlin spokesperson after Russian official described the American and British decision as Provocative in the extreme. A fundamental change in the nature of the conflict. And perhaps most importantly, grounds for Russia to treat the US and UK as co-belligerents in the war. But threats only work if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response was among the most operationally sophisticated strikes we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know. Within 12 hours of receiving official authorization, Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated strike package using both ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles. These weren't the limited, defensive strikes Ukraine had conducted previously with domestically produced weapons. These were deep penetration attacks, precision-guided munitions that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally degrade Russia's war-making capacity. And they did not miss. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on at least 12 high-value targets inside Russia, including a major logistics hub in the Bryansk region that had recently been expanded for what analysts believe was preparation for a winter offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could complete those preparations. They hit an ammunition storage facility containing Iranian-supplied Shahd drone components. They hit a command post coordinating Russian operations in the Kharkiv sector. They hit railway infrastructure that was transporting North Korean artillery shells to the front. They hit fuel depots that would have sustained a mechanized push into Ukrainian territory. In other words, Ukraine targeted the arterial system of Russia's military machine. The logistics that sustain the war. The command nodes that direct it. The infrastructure that makes sustained offensive operations possible. This is what made the timing of the American and British authorization so significant. Putin's red line wasn't just rhetoric, it was strategic. By declaring that Western long-range strikes would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict, Putin was attempting to establish a psychological barrier. He was betting that Biden and Starmer would be too afraid of escalation to cross it. And Ukraine, understanding that the moment had finally arrived, responded with overwhelming force. Not recklessly, not indiscriminately, but with surgical precision designed to maximize military impact while minimizing the risk of civilian casualties. They didn't strike population centers. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They hit military logistics. They hit command and control. They hit the machinery of Putin's invasion. Every single target was selected to degrade Russia's ability to kill Ukrainians. And by early reports, the operation was devastating. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. American and British intelligence officials now believe that Putin's explicit red line was designed to test the resolve of the Western alliance during a period of perceived political uncertainty. Putin wanted to see whether the approaching change in American administrations would create hesitation in the White House. Putin wanted to see whether the relatively new Labour government in Britain would prove more susceptible to nuclear intimidation than its conservative predecessor. Putin wanted to see whether threatening language about co-belligerency would fracture Western unity at a critical moment. But instead, the opposite happened. Biden and Starmer didn't flinch. They issued coordinated authorizations that were so synchronized, so clearly pre-planned, that even Moscow appeared caught off guard. You don't get Putin's attention easily. But this week the transatlantic alliance did. A senior Pentagon official speaking with journalists under condition of anonymity described Putin's red line strategy as coercive theater, a way to create artificial boundaries that limit Ukrainian military options without requiring Russia to actually do anything. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both operationally capable and strategically emboldened by Western support. Their strikes were not only precise, they were timed so perfectly that Russian air defenses had almost no warning before missiles were already descending on their targets. That coordination matters because it shows that the intelligence-sharing relationship between Ukraine and its Western partners has reached a new level of sophistication. It shows that Ukraine is not simply receiving Western weapons and using them independently. They are operating as an integrated partner in a complex, multi-domain military effort. As reports continued coming in throughout the night, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian ATACMS batteries carried out strikes on an airbase in the Kursk region, forcing the evacuation or destruction of at least 8 Russian aircraft. Ukrainian Storm Shadow missiles targeted a radar installation that had been tracking Ukrainian Air Force movements for months. Ukrainian drone units operating in coordination with the missile strikes reportedly hit a Russian electronic warfare site used by Moscow to jam GPS signals. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, taking advantage of the chaos, conducted reconnaissance operations behind Russian lines that will inform future targeting. This wasn't just a missile strike. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. This was combined arms warfare at the strategic level. This was military art executed with precision that would impress any NATO general. And operational surprise is the one thing Russia has struggled to achieve since the early days of the invasion. For every tactical gain Russia has made at enormous human cost, Ukraine has countered with something that undermines Russian logistics, degrades Russian command and control, or simply demonstrates that this war cannot be won through attrition alone. Tonight was the most dramatic example yet of that pattern. Remember, Putin thought the West would eventually tire of supporting Ukraine. He thought that economic pressures, political transitions, and the sheer duration of the conflict would erode Western commitment. He thought that nuclear threats, repeated often enough, would eventually establish psychological constraints that Ukraine's partners would be unwilling to cross. He thought wrong. But tonight the exact opposite is happening. Western support is escalating, not diminishing. Ukraine's military capabilities are expanding, not contracting. And Russia's strategic position is deteriorating in ways that no amount of nuclear rhetoric can reverse. This is not what Putin planned when he launched his invasion. This is not what he expected when he threatened the West with consequences. And this is not what he can sustain indefinitely against a united coalition that has finally decided to give Ukraine the tools it needs. What makes this moment so significant and so volatile is that Putin's red line rhetoric happened at a time when the Russian leader is under extraordinary domestic and military pressure. Russian military bloggers want faster progress and more aggressive tactics. Russian oligarchs want the economic sanctions to end and frozen assets returned. Russian mothers are increasingly organized in demanding answers about their missing sons. Russian security services want to demonstrate that the war investment has been worthwhile. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing a military that has suffered catastrophic losses, over 350,000 casualties by Western estimates, with tens of thousands killed. And when leaders in that position draw dramatic red lines and issue apocalyptic threats, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from fear. They're doing it because they need something, anything, to change the trajectory of a war that is slowly grinding Russia down. That's what makes Putin's response to the crossed red line so revealing. Despite all the threats, despite all the warnings about treating the US and UK as co-belligerents, Russia's actual response has been remarkably muted. Some diplomatic expulsions, some intensified rhetoric on state television, some vague promises of asymmetric responses, but no military escalation against NATO, no use of tactical nuclear weapons, no actions that would actually justify the apocalyptic warnings that preceded this moment. The State Department's formal statement, now distributed to all American embassies worldwide, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow nuclear intimidation to dictate the boundaries of Ukrainian self-defense. Administration officials said plainly that Putin's red line rhetoric was inconsistent with the established norms of international behavior and the inherent right of nations to defend themselves against aggression. That is diplomatic language for, your threats don't work anymore and we're done pretending they might. You don't usually hear that kind of directness from American officials unless something fundamental has shifted in their strategic calculation. Meanwhile, the British Foreign Office issued a parallel statement noting that the United Kingdom will continue to support Ukraine's right to self-defense, including through the provision of long-range strike capabilities, in full accordance with international law. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, speaking to reporters at the White House, put it even more directly. We have always been clear that Ukraine has the right to strike back at the forces attacking it. Today's authorization reflects that principle. The message from both capitals was unmistakable. The era of self-imposed restraint is over. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation and the world in a measured but powerful speech tonight. He said, "For too long, Ukraine has been asked to fight with one hand tied behind our back. Tonight that restraint has ended." He said, "We did not ask for permission to be invaded. We will not ask for permission to defend ourselves." And he said, "Every missile that struck Russian military positions tonight carried a simple message: Ukraine will not surrender, Ukraine will not submit, and Ukraine will win." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands exactly how pivotal this moment is. Zelensky knows that tonight's strikes were not just military operations. They were political statements to Moscow, to Washington, to London, to every capital watching this conflict. Ukraine is capable of striking deep into Russia. Ukraine now has permission to do so. And Ukraine will use that permission as often as necessary to defend its people. Here's what makes the situation even more complex. Putin's response to the crossed red line wasn't isolated. Along with the verbal threats and diplomatic fury, Russian forces launched an intensified missile barrage against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, targeting power stations as winter approaches. Russian cyber units increased their probing attacks against NATO member communication networks. Russian submarines in the Atlantic were reportedly repositioned to more aggressive patrol patterns. Russian state media launched a coordinated propaganda offensive designed to fracture Western public opinion. All of this happened within the same 48-hour window. When Putin responds across multiple domains simultaneously, it means he's trying to demonstrate capability and resolve even while his actual options remain limited. It's the geopolitical equivalent of a cornered animal, making itself look as large and threatening as possible. Dangerous, yes, but also revealing of underlying weakness. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Putin accepts the new reality and recalibrates his red lines, essentially acknowledging that his previous threats were never credible. Another is that Putin attempts some kind of asymmetric response, perhaps cyber attacks, perhaps support for terrorist organizations, perhaps interference in Western elections, designed to impose costs without triggering a direct military confrontation. A third possibility, the one that has officials most concerned, is that Putin, feeling cornered and humiliated, orders an escalatory action that he cannot easily walk back. But today, Ukraine took the initiative. They didn't wait to see which option Putin would choose. They didn't allow the threat of escalation to paralyze their operations. They didn't give Russia time to adjust its defenses. They struck. And in striking, they demonstrated that the power to shape this conflict does not belong to Moscow alone. What we're watching now is a test of credibility. Putin wants to see if his remaining threats still carry weight. Ukraine wants to prove that Western weapons can fundamentally change the battlefield calculus. The United States wants to demonstrate that it will not be deterred by nuclear bluster. And the United Kingdom wants to show that its commitment to European security remains unwavering. All of these tests are playing out simultaneously, and the results will shape not only this war, but the future of international relations for decades to come. Because if Putin's red lines can be crossed without catastrophic consequence, it changes everything. It changes what deterrence means. It changes how democracies respond to authoritarian threats. It changes the calculation that every dictator makes when considering aggression. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian military activity with heightened vigilance. They say that Russian strategic forces remain at their baseline posture, elevated, but not indicating imminent use. They say that Russian conventional forces in Ukraine appear to be scrambling to disperse assets and protect potential targets from further strikes. And they say Putin's decision to issue such an explicit red line, only to have it crossed without consequence, is likely part of a broader pattern of miscalculation that has characterized Russian decision-making throughout this war. But Ukraine is not resting on tonight's success. In fact, Ukraine is preparing for sustained operations. Their strikes today, devastating, coordinated, and precise, sent a message to Putin that the rules of this war have fundamentally changed. And they sent a message to the West that Ukraine knows exactly how to use the weapons it has been given. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about the full scope of Ukraine's operation and Russia's response. But what we do know is that the Biden-Starmer authorization was timely. It shattered the psychological barrier that Putin had tried to erect around Russian territory. It demonstrated that Western unity can withstand Russian pressure. And it gave Ukraine the operational freedom it has been requesting for nearly 2 years. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he accepts this new reality and focuses on damage control, this moment will be remembered as the turning point, when the West finally decided to fight the war Ukraine was already fighting. If he attempts escalation, the United States and United Kingdom have already shown they are prepared for that possibility. They have shown they are not intimidated. They have shown they are ready to respond to whatever comes next. And tonight, for the first time since the invasion began, Vladimir Putin appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet. Unusually quiet. And when Putin is quiet after such a public humiliation, it means he is reassessing. It means he is recalculating the costs and benefits of every option available to him. Because tonight, Putin learned something he should have understood from the beginning. Red lines only matter if your adversary believes you'll enforce them. Threats only work if your target is willing to submit. And democracies, when they finally decide to act together, are far more formidable than any autocrat anticipates. This story is far from over. The war continues. The risks remain. But tonight one thing is clear. The United States and United Kingdom crossed Putin's red line and the world didn't end. Ukraine delivered devastating strikes and Russia's response was impotent fury. And the balance of this war has shifted in ways that Moscow cannot easily reverse. And we will be here, watching every development, as the next phase of this historic conflict unfolds.